In this video, we're going to talk about where red blood cells are born and what that process is called. And you actually already know this. I just wanted to explicitly have that in the learning objectives again. Number two is we want to identify immature red blood cells as reticulocytes. And number three, we want to talk about homeostasis of this system, which hormone is made to respond to this. So first, let's look at red blood cells. You already know that red blood cells are born in the bone marrow. And what is that called? It's called erythropoiesis. And we looked at that previously. We looked at Remember that hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis is made up of things called erythropoiesis, leukopoiesis, and thrombopoiesis. Erythropoiesis is the process of making red blood cells. And again, it happens in the bone marrow. And so if you look at this path, if you look at this slide here, there's not a lot of information here. There's a lot of information, but not a lot that we need to memorize and know necessarily. But I just want to see this big picture. So we have this stem cell here, this hemocytoblast, and in another slide I called it a pluripotent stem cell. But here we have this, it's the same thing here. There's a partial step of differentiation here, where it now becomes a proerythroblast. And when I say that, I suppose it actually is a full step of differentiation, but there's continued maturation that needs to occur. And so here it is a erythroblast, meaning I'm getting ready to become an erythro something, and then you turn into this early erythroblast, late erythroblast, then a normal blast, then a reticulocyte, and finally erythrocyte, which is your full-blown mature red blood cell. So all I want you to know is I want you to know that the reticulocyte is actually what's pushed out into the blood. So this development actually happens all in the bone marrow. But then once you're at the reticulocyte stage, we're now considered, okay, like off you go into the blood. It's ejected from the bone marrow itself. And then in the blood itself, over the next day or two or some short period of time, it then completes its maturation into a full-blown erythrocyte. So what that means then is at any given point in time, if you were to take some blood out, will you see immature red blood cells? Will you see reticulocytes? And you will. You'll see some. And again, eventually they do end up maturing into erythrocytes. So the reason I have this slide here, even though I don't need you to memorize terms like proerythroblast and early and late erythroblast, normoblast, I don't need you to memorize those. What I did want to point out here is this thing over here, is that during development, I have my nucleus and my cellular machinery is just going bonkers, doing a whole bunch of stuff, making a whole bunch of things, making a whole bunch of hemoglobin. It's also making glycolytic enzymes and such. And then when I'm about ready, I'm done, I spit out my nucleus. Because as I said to you guys before, you don't have a nucleus in red blood cells. I spit it out because I don't need it anymore. I'm now full of glycolytic enzymes and all the proteins that I need to do whatever it is I need to do. And obviously a whole bunch of hemoglobin. And then I get pushed out and I finally mature into my erythrocyte. Okay. So what I want to talk about next then is this idea of homeostasis. And so an immature red blood cell is called a reticulocyte. Red blood cells are born in the bone marrow, and it's called erythropoiesis. So the last learning objective in this video is going to be this hormone and this idea of homeostasis. So which hormone triggers the production of red blood cells is called erythropoietin. And where is it made? It's made in the kidneys, and it's made in response to low oxygen levels. So those are the answers for you, but let's look at it. So when you look at the slide, you see that there's some stimulus that disrupts homeostasis and it decreases oxygen delivery to the kidneys. Now, I think this is really cool because the kidneys themselves then are charged with monitoring systemic oxygen levels. So there are other systems out there that also are going to monitor other elements of vasculature. But here, the kidneys are charged with monitoring oxygen levels. So here, there's receptors inside the kidneys. And if you read that, it says kidneys detect low oxygen levels. So what do? As a receptor, in response, they will make this hormone called erythropoietin. And there it is spelled out right over here. It's called erythropoietin. What does erythropoietin do? Erythropoietin then travels to the bone marrow, and it triggers the bone marrow to say, hey, hurry up and make more red blood cells. So this process over here, in the presence of erythropoietin, when erythropoietin is here and it's inundating the bone marrow, then this process just gets faster. This process gets facilitated, and we just do a lot more of it to make more reticulocytes, which then obviously become erythrocytes. And so, again, that is the hormone that's produced. Who produces it? It's the kidneys. It's made in response to what? And this is really critical. It's made in response to low oxygen levels. Look what you're not doing. You're not doing it in response to low red blood cell numbers. You're not counting the number of red blood cells. You're counting or measuring how much oxygen is being delivered to the kidneys. Now, obviously, the more red blood cells you have, the more oxygen you deliver. I understand that, but it's important that we point out what is actually being measured. What is the trigger? And the trigger itself is low oxygen levels. And so when that low oxygen, again, hits the kidneys make erythropoietin, it travels to the bone marrow, I make a lot more red blood cells, and with more red blood cells, of course, I can deliver more oxygen to tissues, and therefore that feedback loop is there. Yay, I'm happy. There's one more slide. This is the same thing. Let's think about homeostasis of, and again, what is homeostasis? It's internal stability. So the question again here is, what am I trying to stabilize? A, am I trying to stabilize the amount of iron in my blood? Am I trying to stabilize B, the number of red blood cells that I have? Am I C, trying to stabilize the number of, reticulocytes in the blood? And the answer is, I'm trying to stabilize blood oxygen levels. So again, it's oxygen that I'm detecting and responding to, okay? Not the number of red blood cells. And yes, the two concepts are coupled together, but they're still distinct concepts. So in this slide, there's nothing new. It's just another way to look at it. Here, there's an imbalance, and I have hypoxia for whatever reason. It says here, maybe I don't have enough red blood cells. Maybe I don't have enough hemoglobin. Maybe I'm not breathing in enough oxygen. I'm not taking it in. Maybe I'm bringing it in, but it's not going from my lungs into my blood. Whatever the reason, if I have low levels of oxygen, it's the kidneys that's going to respond to that. What do? Again, they produce erythropoietin, which stimulates red bone marrow, which enhances erythropoiesis, which increases red blood cell count, and therefore homeostasis, restore homeostasis of blood oxygen levels. So EPO, erythropoietin, is also abbreviated EPO, those letters, EP and O. And so EPO is actually considered a banned substance in athletics. Some people take EPO because they feel like if you increase the number of red blood cells that you have in your blood, well, then you increase oxygen carrying capacity. So therefore, for people in endurance events like Tour de France cycling or marathon running or something like that, which is really dependent on a lot of oxygen delivery, maybe it enhances their performance. And it does. It will enhance their performance. But the question then becomes, well, is there any downside to this? Hang on, before we do that. So some people you've heard of maybe train at, quote, at altitude. So meaning that before an event, before a long distance race or a big cycling event, they'll go to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado or somewhere like that. They'll train at a higher altitude for like a week or so and then come down a day or two before their event in order to compete. And so what that does is that when you're at altitude, for reasons we'll look at in the respiratory system, your body is actually challenged to produce more EPO and therefore produce more red blood cells. Okay, so that's kind of the natural, legal, legit way to do it. But if you artificially take EPO, that is what is considered to be illegal and cheating, and it's a banned substance. So the question then is, well, what's the downside here? Okay, fine, unfair advantages in sports. But outside of that, what is the downside of taking too much EPO and making too many red blood cells? Well, the way I want you to imagine that, what you can picture is think of, let's say we have two cups like this. We got cup A on the left side and cup B on the right side. So again, I just want you to imagine this. Bear with me here. And what I want you to imagine is, let's say each of these little green dots that we see here are glucose, okay, or some sugar. So which one has a higher concentration of glucose, sugar? It's obviously cup B, right? There's a lot more here. So if you drank cup A, it would be sweet. If you drank cup B, it'd be super duper sweet, right? Great. Now, here's what I want you to imagine. Let's say we continue to pump more and more and more of these in here. So I add more and more sugar into my cup here. Can you imagine that eventually, once I kind of saturate that cup, I'm really now going to start to thicken this thing up. And essentially, I'm making syrup at this point, right? This is just a cup filled with glucose or sugar in it. But now, the more and more I put in other words, the more sugar I dump in per unit of volume, then eventually I become more syrup-like. And another way to describe that is to say that my viscosity increases. The thickness of that fluid increases. What I want you to imagine now then is that if you're with me and say, okay, this is now a thicker fluid than this is going to be. This pours out like water still, and this now kind of, there's a lot of resistance to flow like your pancake syrup might. If you get that, then imagine if this is blood. If this is what your blood is normally supposed to be, and each of these now are red blood cells, and now we take EPO, and we take just way too much of it, and your body goes bonkers, and you make a whole bunch of red blood cells. Now, in theory, you have a lot more oxygen carrying capacity, But what is the unintended consequence, unintended side effect? The unintended side effect is that now I've got syrup flowing through my veins instead of like liquid, smooth blood. Now it's syrup-like. Now that is an issue. And we don't know exactly why that's an issue yet, but once we get into the heart, you'll see that, man, that it's just going to change the demands on the heart. Because for the heart to pump out blood is one thing, for the heart to pump out syrup is an entirely different thing, and you place undue demands on the heart, and over time the heart will fail. So this is why EPO, yeah, it's a normally occurring hormone, and yes, it's used clinically for certain clinical conditions. You can kind of naturally induce more EPO production by training at higher levels of altitude because of changes in pressures of oxygens, which we haven't discussed yet. We'll do the respiratory system. But again, when you do this in an uncontrolled way, especially for the purpose of things like sports enhancement, whereas on the one hand it delivers more oxygen, making your heart work that much harder during your event can be catastrophic. So to recap, where are red blood cells born? Bone marrow. What is the process called? It's called erythropoiesis. An immature red blood cell is called, sorry, got distracted by the grammar. An immature red blood cell is called a reticulocyte. And number 3, which hormone triggers the production of red blood cells? It's erythropoietin, also known as EPO. It's made in the kidneys, and it's made in response to hypoxia. And hypoxia is just a fancy way to say low oxygen levels. And that'll wrap it up for this video.